market forces. And please join me in welcoming Mark Lander, New York Times bureau chief in London. He will join us with his speakers. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning. Good afternoon. I have a terrific panel today, two of whom are with us in person and the other two of whom are with us virtually. So I'll do a very quick set of introductions with one short prefatory note. Andrew Steer, the CEO of the Bezos Earth Fund, unfortunately had a conflict and had to cancel, and we're sorry to lose him because he's an important guy with a lot to say. So I hope we'll have a chance to catch up with him at another time. But I am excited about the four panelists that we do have, and why don't I start with very quickly with the two virtual panelists, Pavan Sukhdev, the founder and CEO of Gist. Gist, did I pronounce that right, Pavan? Okay. And Laura Diaz Anadon, a professor at Cambridge, and one of the lead authors of the IPCC report, which we may talk about shortly. And then here, to my right, we have Tare Badagessen, and she's the managing director and CEO of ARM Harith Infrastructure Investment. And then finally, Mark Campanale, who is the founder and executive chair of the Carbon Tracker. So without further ado, I thought I would divide this panel into sort of roughly two different sessions. The first session would be to talk about the problems with using purely market forces to drive innovation in the climate space, and then perhaps to focus in the second half a little on solutions, things that do work, things that do drive innovation. In preparing for this session, I had a conversation with Pavan, and he had a pretty provocative way of thinking about the role of markets in driving innovation, and I guess more to the point, how markets, in his view, fail to drive it adequately in this space. So maybe I thought, Pavan, if you wouldn't mind just kicking it off for us with a bit of what we were talking about, and then we can go to the rest of the panelists.
Sure thing, Mark. Hello, everyone, and great to be with you. So the point that's being referred to is really about what are markets for? Markets are there to discover prices, to provide liquidity, buying and selling. Markets are there to allocate capital, and indeed markets are there to punish the misallocation of capital. All of these things markets do quite well. Quick background, I'm an ex-banker with a passion for environmental economics. I carried on these two careers simultaneously, so I know a fair amount about markets, and having lived that for almost 26 years. And I could see that markets do not solve social problems. Not because they're evil, not because they are inefficient, not because there's market failure, but because they're not designed to solve social problems. And indeed, the word market failure implies, it's kind of part of our unstated religion of economism, it implies there's some kind of market success that's just lurking just around the corner if you could only find out what it was. Actually, what you need to do is to look at mechanisms which include policies and markets, policies and other mechanisms and markets, and look at a mix that can help you to solve social problems. And that takes me to my second point, is that we keep touting innovation as if it's always got to be something very high tech, and that's not true. Innovation isn't just about rocket science and space travel, even though that is very innovative. Innovation is also about recognizing, for instance, that something like 45 to 56% of the greenhouse gas emissions that we are trying to solve actually come from the food systems, if you account for a food system along the entire value chain, including the forest that was cut to create the space to grow the corn or the beef or the soya or the palm oil that then was transported across thousands of miles and therefore further emissions, and finally was consumed, and 1/3 of that was wasted, which is the average, and so on. If you account for the entire value chain of food, those emissions are not 23%, which is the official United Nations number, but it's actually more like half the total emissions. Now, innovation in food systems, and therefore a key solution to climate breakdown, could potentially be redesigning food systems to recognize that agriculture is about biology, not chemistry, and looking at regenerative farming. That could be innovative. Another form of innovation would be, well, what can we do about redirecting subsidies. According to the IMF, if you include externalities, the total amount of subsidy every year for fossil fuels today, in this day and age, is $5 trillion. That's an IMF statistic. Can't that be, of course, you can't reallocate externalities, but you can certainly reallocate the $600 billion of direct subsidies that are given to fossil fuels into other more benign directions. That can be done. And then you can apply micro-policy reform. How about recognizing that today's corporation, which is actually based on the 19th century horse and buggy era, has essentially a need for change. I mean, you need to transform the driver of today's economy. The private sector is 2/3 of the economy measured in terms of GDP or jobs. How about transforming that and applying micro-policy reform, changing the way taxation is done, changing the way corporate performance is quantified and reported, and looking at the way that leverage is actually not controlled at all. And then finally, financial accounting is all about recognizing the world of shareholder capitalism, and we seem to be stuck there. How about recognizing the fact that impact accounting is needed to move to stakeholder capitalism? And I'll leave with my second point with a note of good hope. I just noticed that the ISSB has been launched at the Climate COP26, the International Sustainability Standards Board. This is good news. We can talk more about that later.
Thanks very much, Pavan. There's a couple of strands I wanted to pick up on, and I realize perhaps I'm deviating from my stating the problem before the solution, but Tarje is active in trying to conceptualize smart investment and innovation in Africa, and I think has a few thoughts that you could pick up on that question of what does drive innovation, and do we have to rethink the sort of traditional sources of that for projects that make more sense in a given place, in this case in Africa? I just would throw that to you.
Sure, thank you so much. And so let me just put some context around the problem we're trying to solve in Africa. And if we just speak about the energy sector, Africa, in terms of the average energy consumption per capita, hovers around 505 kilowatt hours per person per year, relative to the global average of 3,000 kilowatt hours per person per year, and the North American average of 11,000 kilowatt hours per person per year. So you see this significant difference. And as African countries are making commitments to net zero, Nigeria, for example, committed to 2060, the need to electrify the entire system and to do that across a spectrum of both distributed energy, off-grid, on-grid, distribution, transmission, storage, grid reinforcement, and all the technology that layers on top is going to be a massive, tremendous endeavor that requires capital. The challenge that Africa faces is that it presents a greenfield opportunity. We do not have the infrastructure in the first instance. So it's not a case where in a developed market, you're building upon a system and adding to it. In this case, in the African case, the infrastructure doesn't exist. And what we've found is that developed economy financial markets and that system is not fit for purpose to build infrastructure into a white space or into an empty space. And so financial innovation and innovation of financial products across the risk spectrum to tackle the bottlenecks toward deploying electrification solutions is where there's a need for focus. And so funds like mine, even just private sector funds, are thinking much more about blended finance solutions. And I know that, I think Pavan touched on that slightly, which is sort of new models for hybridizing risk, allocating risk to those who are ready to take a higher risk at, say, a different type of return. But what we're finding is that if we try to use the standard systems of venture capital, equity, debt to try to build the infrastructure that Africa needs, it doesn't actually work. And you need to really partner across sort of the risk spectrum to figure out how to create new models for financing infrastructure. And then just finally, I want to touch on the point of innovation out of the local context. There is exciting innovation and technology that comes from a global context. But when that is layered onto a developing economy without the business model or application being designed by the entrepreneur in the local context, you also don't have transformation. In Africa today, with the 65% of the population that's under 30, the amount of innovation that comes from this very vibrant group that are figuring out how to solve climate challenges based on their experience is something that needs to be integrated into how we're trying to solve for climate action.
I want to bring Laura into the conversation. And Laura, I know you've thought and written a lot about sort of the notion of carbon pricing and the need for a global price for carbon. How does that general proposition fit into this discussion about driving innovation? What's not happening that needs to happen in your view? And if you want to bring the IPCC report or your role into this, I'd welcome that as well.
Thank you, Mark, and everyone for inviting me. So I will start a little bit challenging what you said, actually, because even though I've argued in a report from the Climate Crisis Advisory Group that it would be beneficial to have a higher carbon price covering a large number of jurisdictions, a large number of sectors, and a large number of greenhouse gases, what we also say in this report, and what most of the literature suggests and shows, is that actually a carbon price would not be enough. So historically, the economics literature in this space had previously suggested that if we could just put the right price on carbon and perhaps support some quote-unquote basic research, market forces would take care of the rest. But what we see is that actually that policy prescription does not reflect, as Pavan was saying, how markets work, what they're designed to do, and how innovation works, because innovation doesn't work just having basic research that then flows on to the whole world, right? And this is particularly something that doesn't work in the area of climate change and sustainable development, which don't require just marginal changes. We don't just require small changes to address these problems, but we require big changes that touch all aspects of the economy. So it's not about patching up one or two market failures, but it's about shaping the market. And we will need to mobilize trillions of dollars per year. And again, I know everyone in the panel is aware of this, starting now. And what this means is that in addition to the financial innovations, I really agree with the points also that Torilla made, we also need governments to be much more proactive at creating and shaping markets, so shaping the direction and pace of technological innovation. And just going back to the point about carbon prices, again, it would be beneficial to have a higher carbon price covering more sectors and so forth, but it would not be sufficient. So it's necessary in the long run, but not sufficient for a range of reasons. The first one, and actually not the main one, is that we're unlikely to get to a carbon price that is meaningful enough to get to changes by 2030, to have emissions by 2030, which is what we need to do. Right now, we only have around 22%, not even just under 22% of emissions covered by carbon prices, and only about 5% of those are above $40 per ton of CO2. But actually, the two main reasons why carbon prices would not be enough, even if we had a higher carbon price, is that actually there are other issues and other barriers in this sector, from private investment in R&D to the phenomenon of learning by doing and economies of scale, meaning that there are benefits from creating early markets for technologies that are not yet cost competitive, but that if you create early markets, you end up getting cost reductions. There are also failures in capital markets, and again, we saw the case of the financial crisis. We also have the energy sector where there are a lot of networks. It's a complex system, so we have cities, we have transport, we have the grid, right? So it's very hard to imagine how the private sector could just do this by itself. It's a very complex system. And then, of course, there are other aspects, and I'm focusing on the energy sector, since Pavan touched on food and agriculture. So we have other things like pollution and ecosystems, as well as information. Investors don't know what the carbon impacts or the climate risks are. Consumers don't really often have information about the carbon footprint. So we have a lot of things that mean that even if we had a high price on carbon, we wouldn't get to where we need to go. But then actually, and I'll conclude with this, there's a very practical reason, which is that the experience we have on the ground of what has driven technological innovation in a lot of these areas where we've seen tremendous progress. So we have seen over the past 10 years, the cost of solar PV and lithium-ion batteries and solid-state lighting go down by around 80, 90%, for on and offshore wind by about 50%. And all of this was actually due to, yes, the inventors and the private sector innovating, but responding to a couple of things. And I could go to the histories of all of these technologies if people are interested, but it was always through a combination of public research, funding for development and demonstration, as well as different forms of creating early markets. So overall, I think we have a lot of evidence on the ground of what has made these huge improvements in technologies possible, and it's just not something that one can explain without this major role that governments across the world, so it wasn't just the US or just usual suspects. Actually, in a lot of these energy technologies, it was countries in Europe, it was Japan, it was China more recently. In solid-state lighting, we also have India has done some things recently. So we have countries all over the world that have already put in place these policies, and now we just need to learn from this experience and tackle some of the technologies where we either don't have the technology or it's not yet cost competitive. And this will require a new way of doing public policy.
Thanks very much, Lara. So I guess it sounds like the evolving consensus is a viable carbon pricing system is necessary but not sufficient. You, Mark, have thought about the notion of what you once called unburnable carbon for a long time. I wonder whether you could maybe pick up on what Lara was saying about sort of the inadequacies in the carbon pricing market, and maybe how it leads to what you were talking about earlier in the fossil fuel area and investment in fossil fuels.
Yeah, I mean, let's be clear, we do need a global carbon price, but there's plenty of other things that investors and financial market regulators can do in the absence of a carbon price, and I really want to turn my remarks to that. Mm-hmm. Before I talk about the good news, and maybe we'll do that in the following questions, let's look at the scale and size of the problem. So the challenge we have is the fossil fuel industry is absolutely embedded within financial markets for the very simple reason we've got 200 years of industrialization built on fossil fuels. Cement, steel, aviation, shipping, power, transportation, it's all the way through the system. And yet by reducing emissions by 50% over the next 10 years, what we're really talking about is totally turning over the capital stock of the global economy. Now, so how big is that? So Carbon Tracker, and we're a non-profit financial think tank. Most of my colleagues are, like myself, worked in Wall Street or the City of London as analysts. We estimate there's around $20 trillion of fixed assets of the fossil fuel system, pipelines, oil rigs, coal-fired power stations. We're going to have to start writing that down. There's about $8 trillion of equity capital represented in pension fund ownership of the fossil fuel economy, and then there's multiple sides of debt. We estimate that something like half of a global corporate debt, non-bank corporate debt, is linked to the fossil fuel economy. So clearly this has consequences if you're an investor. To get to grips with the climate challenge, we have to know and understand where those risks are in our portfolio. So that's to sort of set out the scale of it. Turning to fossil fuels in the financial system today, we know that we're going through an expansion phase in oil and gas in particular. The growth forecasts that people are using are assuming a lot more oil and gas production. There's still coal finance happening. In our report, The Tale of Two Share Issues, we found that since the Copenhagen COP, there have been 2,500 coal, oil, and gas initial public offerings on the world's financial markets. And I don't know if you spotted it, there was a coal IPO on the London market last week. So just before the COP, what does London do? Have another coal IPO. Does it really make any sense? So we're tied into this system. Well, the good news is that institutional investors are now onto this, and they're trying to model carbon prices in their financial models to try and work out how a carbon price will affect future demand for oil and gas. Investors are getting a bit savvy. I mean, the good news is that, and I'm on the advisory council for this, is the launch of GFANZ, the Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero. That's a $130 trillion coalition. I think I'm right in saying it's the biggest investor coalition ever built at any time of this size, and it's bringing all the pension funds and insurance companies and fund managers to travel together on this goal of how do we decarbonize the global economy, how do we start reallocating capital, how do we measure risk, can we work together on things like a carbon price, can we think about switching to low carbon solutions, can we finance energy efficiency systems, and can we decarbonize the financial market. Now, the financial market isn't everything. Government is there too. We need government for policy. But we've actually now at this Glasgow COP, we've got private finance stepping into the gap, as it were, to pick up where governments have often left off. I wasn't at the meeting, but the Prime Minister of the UK was at a meeting of global financial institutions in Windsor, and he said to the audience, well, governments have billions, but of course you investors, you count in trillions. And he was absolutely right. And that, I think, really is the good news of this COP, is that investors are mobilizing, regardless of what governments are doing, and they want to get to their own decarbonization goals in step with their clients. And so that's the positive side. It's a bit more complex, and we can come to that in the Q&A.
Pavan, just, and then I will turn to the Q&A soon enough, but Pavan, I just wanted to ask you, since you sort of laid out the critique, to offer maybe your view of the remedy or the good news side of the equation. And I think you alluded to it with that notion of how you think about more broadly than just shareholder interest. But you mentioned a couple of projects in India. I thought maybe you could describe those, and that might give us a way to start focusing on the remedies as opposed to the problems.
Sure, maybe two projects, and I'll pick off where Mark left off, which is Mark, you were talking about risks in portfolios and measuring the risk, and of course you cannot manage what you do not measure. So clearly, the first thing that one needs to recognize is that we have too much by way of externalities embedded in today's portfolio, and today's externalities are tomorrow's risks and day after tomorrow's losses. And God help, for the sake of argument, a private equity fund who discovers that in year 8 or 9 of a 10-year horizon. So you need to know your risks. You need to know your externalities in your portfolio when you begin. That's the hidden alpha, or it could be the hidden negative alpha, which is really the problem. So I'll say that up front, is that today we are in a much better state to actually measure impacts and therefore know the externalities and therefore understand and appreciate and size the risks that are coming further down the line. Yes, we don't know whether it'll come in a year's time or 2 years or 10 years time, but we know they're coming. So that's point one. Point two is that we also know the positive externalities. And this is where I think, Laura, you mentioned positive examples. And certainly in the case of India, there's an amazing example that's coming up, which is scaling, which is in the state of Andhra Pradesh, which is in the eastern side of India. A state of 55 million people with 6 million farmers. 700,000 of them have converted to what's known as natural farming, which, by the way, is pretty much the same principles as what people in the West call regenerative farming, or the Japanese might call the one-straw revolution, and so on. It goes by different names, but basically recognizing that you need to re-inject biology in the soil. In other words, re-inject bacterial life in the soil, stop using pesticides and fertilizers, chemical pesticides and fertilizers, which destroy soil biology, and try and regenerate it, and then use various different techniques. And they are successful. Yields have gone up in everything from the eight forms of rice that they grow out there in Andhra Pradesh to their main cash crop, which is basically groundnuts, peanuts, across to the higher level cash crops like chilies and so on, and fruit, which they grow pomegranates and mangoes and papayas and so on. So they're seeing higher yields across the entire spectrum of their crops. They're seeing a halving on average of water usage. They're seeing carbon capturing agriculture as against carbon generating agriculture. In other words, positive for climate, not the other way around. And of course, perhaps the reason why they do this, and that's what I keep hearing, I've visited this place 5 times in the last few years. Every time I hear the stories that, our health is better. And look at the soil, and they'll always dig it out and show me some earthworms in the soil. See, the soil's health is better. And then they usually take a dig at me saying, if you eat our food, your health will be better, sir. So, this is amazing. This is happening right now as we speak.
I was on a panel a few days ago with the head of a global fertilizer company, and one of his proposals was to make soil an asset class, which I thought was kind of an interesting concept. Laura, you mentioned a little while ago a couple of things that you thought were also positive, optimistic examples in the area of kind of innovative investment, and you sort of flicked it a couple. Is there one or two you wanted to sort of bring out, discuss in a little more detail before we go further?
Yes, thank you, Mark. So we have these various stories of how innovation in the technologies I mentioned work, but I will highlight wind and lithium-ion batteries. And as I mentioned, onshore and offshore wind, they've gone down in cost over the past 10 years by 48% and 54% respectively. And what made this possible? And what we know is that it's taken decades. We need to go faster, and that's partly why I made the point that we need to accelerate and change how governments make decisions, how they create policies, the investments they make. And what we saw for wind is that we had a combination of R&D investments around the world, sparked by the oil crisis. So, hopefully we'll get more in response to what is now very clearly a climate crisis. We also had companies like GE involved. We had experimentation and standardization again in Denmark in the late 70s. Then we had investment tax credits in California in the 70s and early 80s. And then in the 1990s, we had subsidies from Germany when they were partly reacting to the, not just the oil crisis, but also the anti-nuclear movement. And then we had all over Europe feeding tariffs, and then China also putting in place policies, including local content requirements. So now we've moved to auctions. And in the UK, we've seen that there was a big role for the government and then entrepreneurs and researchers and project developers in offshore wind, where we saw the Carbon Trust having an offshore wind technology incubator, and then deployment programs, including contracts for differences. So we do see that these major improvements in wind were, a range of policies in different parts of the world, right? And when we look at lithium-ion batteries, I wanted to mention this example because, we have kind of some, unexpected development. So there was a lot of research on batteries that also was sparked by the oil crisis. We had the US government also funding research to not be so dependent from imported oil and so forth. We have Nobel Prize winner, people who won Nobel Prizes from this in 2019. And we see that there was a lot of public funding for research from the US and France and South Africa in the 80s. Then also some private companies. So Exxon did some work on lithium-ion batteries. We had national labs creating tools for analysis. We had Sony in Japan, who then said, well, maybe I can use these emerging lithium-ion batteries for electronics. So this is a case in which a company saw, well, this thing that was developed in response partly to the oil crisis, we're going to use for cameras and things like this. So this is one example in which we had a private company and a sector, a niche market that was not in this case created by the market, that took the technology further, but still that wasn't enough because the applications, the needs for batteries in transportation are very different. The energy density and the power density are very different. And then what happened is that this jump from consumer electronics, from the iPhones and so forth, into the electric vehicles, again, was spurred by incentives from governments around the world, including purchase subsidies, registration tax rebates, and of course loans for companies like Tesla by the US government. So we do see that there's this complementary role that, again, I think Tarija was talking about, of public and private actors, but it's very hard to explain these technologies without this major role creating incentives, saying, okay, this is where we want to go, this is funding, this is a regulation that makes it possible for the private sector to invest in scaling up these technologies and getting us down the cost curve. I could go on with many examples, but I think these two are quite useful.
Tarija, I was sort of interested, you said earlier that the important insight about Africa is that you're dealing with a lack of infrastructure. And Mark was talking about this massive capital stock in much of the rest of the world that effectively has to be written down over time. So I guess I was just wondering, from your point of view, is there any advantage to Africa not having this vast legacy infrastructure from an investment innovation point of view? Is that a reason why one could have some hope for Africa despite all the obvious challenges?
Absolutely. And I think there's a lot of potential for Africa to avoid going down a carbon-intensive path toward industrialization and urbanization, and rather embed low-carbon infrastructure and energy-efficient approaches into its economic development path. However, that is going to require innovation across policy, government incentives, and capital. But it is really a great opportunity for Africa and even for the global community to think about Africa as a great incubator for applying these more efficient forms of technology to an economic development curve. And I'll draw on the point of batteries. It's quite interesting. In Nigeria, because there is such a challenge with electricity in Nigeria, the use of batteries and inverter systems as a standard application in a household, the same way a household may acquire a fridge, they would acquire a battery backup system, actually has shown that Africans are using storage as part of their day-to-day energy system, and folks are starting to think about how you can actually create almost a consumer system around battery technology, and that is actually being rolled out on a day-to-day basis today. And so this is something that can be built upon, and the reality is that even in terms of distribution infrastructure and reinforcing the grid, the opportunity to embed battery technology into sort of building out the grid and reinforcing the grid so that you don't have to invest as much into grid architecture is also a key area of innovation. And then finally, the opportunity around distributed energy. So one of the big challenges we have in Africa is because we have such a weak transmission system, there is an approach right now to use distributed energy where we have smaller off-grid solutions that are not connected. Eventually, they'll need to be connected. But the off-grid arena is really interesting because you find that there's innovations using basically smaller solar and battery type systems for, say, a 1,000 to 10,000 community. But what's been a very interesting area of innovation is around layering on payment solutions onto that using digital networks. And so once again, Africa is actually almost moving ahead in terms of how we manage credit risk around sort of off-grid technologies. So Africa does have a great opportunity to embed a greener, sort of a green pathway toward economic development, but it's going to take innovation.
Thanks. Well, that's actually all rather hopeful, having set out in a slightly more skeptical way. We have about 11 minutes left. Unless any of the four of you want to make a last point about this phase of the discussion, Mark, you want to jump in for a moment? Yeah.
I just want to comment. I think that the point of this particular panel and the challenge is how do we mobilize the capital that we know exists in the global north into the global south? And we have to find the right kinds of mechanisms. And if you look at the sort of the climate investment funds, the mechanisms set up by the World Bank and others, they're very turgid. We've got to find ways of locking together government guarantees and policy together with the private capital to really do this at scale. And Carbon Tracker's work, we produced a paper called The Sky's the Limit. We just made the obvious point that fossil fuels are by definition finite, whereas renewable energy is by definition infinite. And a country or continent like Africa has 100 times more renewable energy resources than it does fossil fuels, and it's just a question of capturing it. And the great news, I think, for the sector is that renewables just are on steep learning curves, are just getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, to the point, and there was a great study published by the University of Oxford, INET, that said that there will be a multi-trillion-dollar dividend because renewables are so much cheaper, and most of that's going to flow to the global south because, of course, a lot of people living in developing countries are net importers of fossil fuels, and we can eliminate that. And so what I want to hear is the ideas that it's going to unlock private capital to get it into the kinds of strategies that I know you're developing in West Africa and go further afield, Southeast Asia as well.
Excellent. Well, listen, I want to go to Q&A. We have 10 minutes left. I'd only ask that when I call on you, maybe you just identify yourself, and then if you want to ask a particular panelist, do so. Otherwise, we can throw the question open. There's a gentleman in the first row over here, and there will the people coming around with microphones.
Thank you. My name is Arturo Garcia-Cosas. I'm with the New York Community Trust Foundation in the United States. So thank you very much for your comments today. I couldn't help but think, as I listened to you all, that we are still dealing with a situation where we have economic systems and financial systems that are saddled with short-term and externalized or a short-term and distorting metrics of success. And the carbon price is an example of trying to deal with those distortions, but it seems like we're trying to jury rig solutions to these profoundly flawed systems. So when it comes to full cost accounting, is there a way of looking at full benefit accounting? What strategies are there to influence decision makers in government, in the private sector, to do both things? Full cost accounting to address externalities, and full benefit accounting to address how investments can really have a broader impact.
Pavan, I see you raising your hand. You wanted to jump in, and also Lara? Yeah, go ahead, Pavan, and then Lara.
Very quick. Thank you for that question. Very quickly, I'd say that impact accounting is exactly the space that you're asking about, which is full costs and full benefits. A company, through training and development, such as a technology firm or a bank, produces a huge amount of positive externalities through human capital impacts. And companies which have CSR programs will generate positive externalities on social capital through their CSR programs. And of course, I know at least one forestry firm, C.E.O, whose integrated profit and loss my company just had done, which generates something of the order of 18% of the total of the Paris target of Sweden, basically through its forestry policy. I mean, it happens to be 15% of Sweden's forests, but that's not surprising, therefore. But the thing is, these abilities to create full value accounts, essentially what are known as impact accounting, or are also referred to as impact valuation, and sometimes referred to as true cost accounting, and so on. These are all happening things today, and we have the leaders both on the asset management side and as well as on the corporate sustainability side, engaging these forms of exploration. What isn't yet happening is standardization and mandating of these processes. So I think this is where I'm delighted that we have the ISSB. The International Accounting Standards Board basically has formed something called the ISSB, which is going to create, I hope, a kind of full cost accounting approach, which will require the publication of both positive and negative externalities. And they're there in different forms of capital. We have to be careful about ideas like netting and so on, but at the same time, we need to be encouraging of ideas like measuring and disclosing your full impacts. And this today, my friends, is happening. It is not only possible, it is mandated in certain a certain context, where we're moving in the European Union, for instance, towards disclosing the impacts of banks, lending and investment activities and financial institutions. And I think that's a step in the right direction. It's heading there. It needs to go faster. It needs to scale much faster as well.
Lara, and then Mark wants to add something. Go ahead, Lara.
Yes, so Artur, I couldn't agree more. And I think what I was trying to say with the comments is that because we need such big changes in how different parts of our economy, we cannot just tinker. And cost-benefit analysis, which is one of the tools most widely used by policymakers around the world to assess policies, is really not suitable for making the types of strategic investments, creating the types of incentives that are needed. And in fact, it's very hard to prove, but it's very unlikely that the sort of investments that made these big improvements in the technologies I mentioned possible would not have passed standard cost benefits analysis. So I will just mention that just last Friday in the COB, we released a report called The New Economics of Innovation and Transition, Evaluating Opportunities and Risks. And we talk exactly about this problem, about the common tools used by policymakers or the common paradigms as not being adequate to really put in place the sort of investments that would make a transition possible, while also making sure that we either minimize dislocations and also make the transition a just one. So this was a report that we did in conjunction with, a lot of researchers in Cambridge, where I am, but also at Oxford, at UCL, and in different parts of the world. So we have researchers from TERI in India, from ERI in China, and also researchers from Brazil and Italy. So this might be useful, Arturo.
Thanks, Laura. Mark.
Thanks, Arturo, for your question, and I'm a great believer in this assimilating or incorporating the value of natural capital into full cost accounting. But I do want to make some very quick points. We can get the architecture of the global financial markets right, and we can do that now without having to worry about changing economics. Let's do some simple ones. I talked earlier about the 2,500 coal, oil, and gas IPOs that raised hundreds of billions of dollars. Here's a campaign for the New York Times. The two financial centers that led this were New York and London. Why don't we do a ban on fossil fuel bond issuances and IPOs? Let's just say exchanges, no more listing of fossil fuels. Let's start there. The second one, I think, is doable. If we're to stabilize the global economy, I think we need to create a good bank, bad bank. Put all the fossil fuel assets in a bad bank, like we did with the financial crisis, and then release the balance sheets of the banks and the pension funds to refinance the green economy. This idea of a good bank, bad bank, we should be thinking about it now, because at the moment, there's banks that are going to go down given the size and the scale of their fossil fuel loans. And there's plenty more ideas along those that we could talk about.
Another question. There's a gentleman, I'll come back to you, sir, in this first row. There's a gentleman in the second row with the blue face mask.
Hi, Edwin Morgan. I'm from Harvest London, which is a vertical farming company. This is really for Laura, but other people touched on it as well. There was quite a lot of optimism about government's abilities to design sort of smart policies. But before I did vertical farming, I worked in a business membership group and interacted a lot with the British government. So this is really just about the British government. But they are not that good at designing smart policies, sticking to them, and coordinating across all the different parts of government. So I suppose, how optimistic are you actually that governments can do more subtle things than just subsidies or carbon pricing or things like that? Thank you.
Yes, thanks for the question. I think that's partly why, again, I'm here. I'm not talking just about the UK government. I'm talking in general, because we require such a big transition. And again, I will stick to this. We do need private actors to do all the things that we're talking about, but it's very hard to imagine a world in which they're doing enough to get us where we need to be without regulatory and fiscal policy, okay? Yeah. And the key thing here is that we will need new ways of doing policy. So we will need new capabilities to be, we need government policymakers and institutions within governments to be able to track progress, to be adaptable, flexible, gather data, interact with different stakeholders, not just private actors, but also civil society. So doing this in a way in which we have a smooth transition that is just and that moves sufficiently fast does require governments to have new institutions, new capabilities, new ways of working. We do know very well that governments around the world in different occasions are, we have issues when you study public administration, public policy, yes, regulatory capture, we have, unwillingness or lack of willingness to acknowledge that things are not going well. So you look at programs around the world and, the civil servants in different places it might not be in their own interest to discover that their program is not working. So I very much recognize some of the problems that can emerge with government action. But again, we do know that we have made some of these investments. Could we have made them more efficiently? Maybe. But I think without these new capabilities in government institutions, this willingness to be flexible, adapt, be evidence-based, is very hard to see how we make a difference. But we do need a different way of doing policy to avoid the problems that the gentleman who asked the question raised.
Tarja wanted to take a crack at this.
Sure, 20 seconds. I think the interest that the private sector has shown going forward is actually critical, because the private sector can play a really strong role in multi-stakeholder engagement to support governments in policy design that would further support mobilization of capital. Something else I'm seeing in governments, and again, even private actors like myself are trying to encourage, is that how do you mainstream climate into policy? Historically, a lot of climate action has actually been under the purview of sort of like one ministry or one commission as such. And now you're finding a lot of governments are centralizing it into almost like the economic strategy system, where you have like the best-in-class players, and they're, you know, you have, this is the first COP I hear that many ministers of finance attended, you know, so it's almost like climate and climate action is becoming central economic policy. And so maybe I'm very optimistic, but I do think multi-stakeholder engagement and multi-stakeholder interest, especially with the private sector being much more clued in, much more interested, could potentially improve innovation in policy and government.
I'm very, very sorry, but we've run out of time. In fact, we're slightly over our time. I know one or two of you had questions. Perhaps you can come up afterwards and talk to the speakers. But with that, we are out of time. I thank my four panelists, Pavan, Lara, Mark, Tarja. I think it was a really good conversation with both the challenges and the possibilities fully aired. So thank you all for coming, and thank you to my four panelists. And
nice to meet you.